Hello, welcome to the CSPC 2022 pre-conference sessions. This specific session is titled Moving Canada to Person-Centric and Data-Driven Health Systems. So I'm Kim McGrail. I'm originally from the US and now based in Vancouver, where I'm a professor in the School of Population and Public Health at UBC, and I'll be the moderator for today's panel. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. So while we're meeting in a virtual platform, I'm personally speaking with you from the unceded and traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to reconciliation, to improving relationships between nations, and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. I'm also influenced by something that an Indigenous colleague said to me not long ago, which is that we need to put the land and people back into data. And this seems particularly important for the conversation we're going to have today about health data, and in a time when the connection between our human activities and the land on which we live is so very clear. I think we can all recognize that health data are important to each of us as individuals. They are also equally important for populations and the multiple communities to which we all belong. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to each of these speakers on this panel. I'll do this in the order that you will hear them give their opening comments, and this will be brief as the full biographies are available on the CSPC website. So Michael Wolfson is a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences and an elected member of the International Statistic Institute, retired professor and assistant chief statistician. Doug Manuel is a senior scientist in the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute and a distinguished professor at the University of Ottawa. Parthenopoulos is a professor at McGill University in the Center of Genomics and Policy. And Stephen Hoffman is the Vice President of Corporate Data and Surveillance Branch with the Public Health Agency of Canada. So we will have time for questions, so please feel free to submit your questions through the Zoom chat. I'll keep track of those and ask them when we get to that part of the program. And then before I hand things over to Michael for the first set of comments, we do have a couple poll questions to pose to you to get things started. So if we could launch those polls, it'd be great. Are we able to see the results?
Results are coming in slowly, yes.
Okay.
Just a few more moments. You should see the results to the poll.
Great. Great. That answer to the second question is particularly pertinent for today's discussion. So Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kim. Let me flip over to share my screen if I can find the right one to share. Here it is. I thought it would be useful to start off with a few words about why we need person-centric health data by giving you some illustrative use cases. As you'll hear in a few minutes from Bartha, there is a health data charter that talks and puts person-centric health data right at the beginning or middle. And the most obvious reason we would like and we need this is for individuals when we're patients or getting care of some sort or other, that the data should be accessible to anyone in our circle of care. I've heard in the media in the last couple of days with the health ministers conversations, references to indicators. Indicators are nowhere near enough or near what we're talking about because at the very least you want to be able to understand why a given indicator, whether it's wait times or anything else, is moving where it is, so that you need individual level data underneath, person-centric data. An important example, quite old now, is about adverse drug reactions. There was a problem with a drug called Viax that increased the risk of heart attacks. The current adverse drug reaction process is, the doctor reports something, or you go to your pharmacist. This is no good when you have complex things where you need a statistical analysis. We did a study, another example, about how heart bypasses and stents, 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago. And there was just dramatic differences in the way that surgeries were performed with no obvious effect on health outcomes. But nobody, it took a huge amount of work to do this with person-level data, person-centric data, but it didn't seem to ever be updated. And everybody's concerned these days with long COVID, but how the heck are we going to know about long COVID unless we have data that are person-centric and linked and all that good stuff, and subjected to careful statistical analysis? No, this is tricky. Yes, this is nothing new, the need for person-centric data and related better data. The Canadian Institute for Health Information was founded almost 20 years ago. I won't go into the details here, but it was founded on some promises, and they're still not done. The Canada Infoway has been given billions of dollars over the last 20 years. In particular, post-SARS, they were given well over $100 million to do something for a new health information system for infectious disease surveillance. It failed miserably. It wasn't there when we needed it. In 2004, there was a first ministers meeting, and one of the areas, 2 or 3 areas that was highlighted was home care. $40 billion was transferred to the provinces, but no good comparable, and data was part of it. Accountability was part of it, but no good comparable data have resulted. In 2017, there was another $11 billion transferred to the provinces. Home care again was a priority because nothing happened in 2004. There was specific direction to produce some data, but again, nothing. Here we are 5 years later, nothing. So what observation can you draw from these few examples? The federal government has time and again provided incentives, carrots to the provinces, but they never attached any strings to the fiscal transfers, and the result has been repeated failures. Jurisdiction over healthcare. My view is when I hear the provinces say this is our jurisdiction, this is a fig leaf for them not wanting to do anything. Provinces and territories have repeatedly claimed it's their jurisdiction, but anybody who studies the Constitution at all will realize that health is really a shared jurisdiction. And indeed, for statistics and quarantine, especially if quarantine is read more broadly, it's explicitly a federal jurisdiction. Beyond that, the federal government is a major funder of health research. There's hundreds of millions of dollars that have been devoted to population health and health services research, a couple of major surveys. But these data sets are seriously underperforming because the provinces are blocking or, in effect, restricting sharing any data across provincial boundaries. So those are some of the problems here. Provinces, if they, I think, thought about it, would realize that they can and should be able to learn from each other. We do have, in effect, natural experiments going on as different provinces try different things, but you can never learn if you can't share the data. Last slide here. So what are the obstacles that have been the blockages here and that we need to overcome? One of them is privacy chill, and the world has gotten more challenging here because there are real and growing concerns, especially for social media. You hear about that all the time. But there have been no significant privacy issues with authorized health data and healthcare quality analysis. Too many data custodians err on the side of blocking access. They get in trouble if there's a breach on their watch, but they get nothing positive if something useful is done. We should never forget about software vendors who would like to lock in their clients by making things not interoperable. I think a big one, and perhaps the dominant one in the last day and a half, with the health ministers being told by their prime ministers or premiers not to do anything, is fears of embarrassment. And as soon as we actually have decent data, there's no doubt that ministers, their deputies, and indeed hospital CEOs and doctors, there may be a bad apple or poor quality care that's discovered. But how can we learn and fix these things unless we are able to analyze the data? We should not, excuse me, be continually hiding our heads in the sand. Until this week, a major problem has been federal reticence to attach strings to the fiscal transfers. I already mentioned the 2004 and 2017 First Minister's Health Accords. The wonderful thing of the last couple of days is the federal government has finally said, if you want the money, part of the requirement is going to be working together to produce a world-class health data system. And the benefits of such a system far outweigh any embarrassment that health ministers, their premiers, and others, leaders in the health sector, are likely to experience. So thank you very much. And I need to stop sharing.
Great. Thank you for that, Michael. So Doug, over to you.
Yeah. Sorry. I was asked to make comments about what the data has been like during the pandemic and any lessons learned from that. And I think we've all been through this together. And I think we all have this view in some ways of what has happened. And it's sort of been the best of worlds and the worst of worlds in some ways. And I think some of the best of the world, I think it was January 5th or 6th, where the Chinese published the sequence of SARS-CoV-2. And that was used worldwide. You can create vaccines just from the data. And so we had this rapid open sharing that accelerated science and public health interventions. And we had things like Our World in Data, where we can almost real time see waves coming towards us from Europe and different variants. Within a few days, cases and hospitalizations around the world are being shared. And then we've had the worst of times as well. And anyone working in this, and I'm sure everyone's on it, has felt incredible frustration throughout the pandemic, accessing, sharing, and using data. I'm going to give two examples for this. One is information and not data. And Michael and I are still on the national modeling network that's organized by FAC and with modelers across the country. And FAC was generating these beautiful reports every few weeks, every month, and we would repeatedly ask, "Can we share it?" And repeatedly said, "No, you can't share it. It's just for you." And you look at that report, and then why? This is the way that we've been told. So lack of very vague reason, no specificity, nothing in the report. When you look at it, you say, there's nothing here that can't be shared. There's nothing private. There's nothing personal. And internationally, the public health agencies were having all this information. And in Canada, we had very little information. Why would you share data with the federal government if you don't get anything back? And it's just, you're sitting there, you can't share this information and you don't know why. So that's one example. The other example that I spend a lot of time on is wastewater surveillance. And I kind of feel in some ways like, I think it was Obi-Wan, like, you're the chosen one. This was one that was perfect. It was, privacy is not an issue really. It's population-based data. It's the new one. So it's not encumbered by all of the things and data jams that we've had over the past. So it was perfect for this. We have wastewater testing at the federal level, provincial level, and academic labs. Across the board, we have very, very little information today after 2 years. And, why was that? In Ottawa, over 2 years ago, we just put the data openly on, 613 COVID. There's been 1.4 million views just on that site, let alone it being reproduced. And we thought like this would just trigger it off and everyone would be starting to do the same thing. It hasn't happened. In Ontario, we're spending almost $40 million. I helped develop that. I don't even know the 170 sites where they are. There's 14 labs, academic labs testing. People don't know who those labs are. And the data is largely inaccessible. Federal level, it's no better. Provincial level, it's no better. there is some data, but you can't build the system without comparing sites across. It's just a finicky system. And so we've had this sort of best of the worlds and worst of the worlds, even for something that should have been easy. The barriers, and so why did that happen? I have just 2 slides. I'm going to share the screen. And here's my screen. So, you know, when my thesis to you is that what I've heard mostly, both the benefit and the beauty of data sharing and the challenges during the pandemic have not been about technical reasons. They've been about human reasons. And this is a partial list from this systematic review. I've heard these comments dozens, maybe 100 times throughout the system over the last 2 years, at the federal level, academic level, provincial level, everywhere. And, you know, and sometimes I've heard maybe half a dozen of these within a minute. So these are really kind of these, you know, data, we want data about people, but people collect data, people share data, people are responsible for this. And I think even what you're seeing in the last week, this is about, again, trust, acknowledgement, shame, some of these things that Michael was just talking about. So we have around the world good and bad examples. And my thesis to you wouldn't be it's because the data systems or the data sharing agreements, it's about the organizations and cultures. And if you look at this, the blue ones are kind of the good things and what we need, and the red ones are the challenges or the emotional, really the emotional dysfunction. And I would suggest to you, or it's interesting to see how many of these link over. What Michael was just talking about, this fear and anxiety, this shame, this acknowledgement, I need to be acknowledged. And we're getting to this, I feel like we're getting to this part where we're now feeling sad, and we're feeling lonely. And if we could just have that trust and closeness, and we're not going to be able to have data in Canada unless we understand not the technology and the data sharing, the payment transfers. I think we need to pay more attention to our organization, our people working in the field, the culture that we have for data sharing in Canada. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Doug. And now over to Bartha.
Hi, everyone. I'm not sad. I think I'm just very disappointed. A lot of the people on the panel today, and probably you in the audience, are aware of current events in terms of the attempts to share health data across the provinces. And this dates way back in 2015. The Canadian Council of the Academy issued a report on timely access to health data. Some of us here on the panel have been working for 2.5 years on an expert advisory group on a pan-Canadian health data strategy. But I think what really shocked me into action, which is why you can't be sad because then you won't do anything, you'll be disappointed because it moves you, is that during COVID, various committees, national committees and international committees that I sat on, just simply couldn't get the data. And in Canada, we couldn't get the viral data from the public health labs. These are public health, it's for the public, it's viral data, doesn't have your name on it, it's a virus, couldn't get that shared. Another project on genomic data, who was dying of COVID, what was their genome, were they more resistant, were they more susceptible, and so on and so on. Again, hiding behind all kinds of presumed legal and ethical barriers. First slide, please. So the group, the expert advisory group on the pan-Canadian health strategy, in our work, we decided that what we needed maybe was sort of an aspirational document. Why are we doing this? Why do we keep saying this? Why is nothing working? Because we need a level of shared ideas. And so this the proposed health data charter for Canada takes a different route. It starts at universal rights, 3 particular rights, which of course have other rights with them: the right to health, the right to benefit from science, and the right to non-discrimination. So those are the foundations. Added to that, we went back and we looked at, what about the Canada Health Act? What does it say? Well, look at it. It says public administration, comprehensiveness, universality, portability. You get sick in BC and your records are in Quebec, for instance, and accessibility. I won't even talk about accessibility. Anybody living in Quebec knows how bad that is. And then looked at the speech from the throne, improving data collection across health systems to inform future decisions. So with the speech from the throne, with these 3 human rights, with the 5 principles, we then worked on the following. Next slide, please. So this is a really heavy slide. You'll see that we started by, can you put the next slide up, please? That we wanted to honor the duty to put persons and populations at the core of all decisions. So that was can you keep it up? And so that was the goal about concerning the disclosure, access, and use of health data. Now, the interesting part, before we get to the content, is if you look at the context. Sorry for the small label size. It's like the grocery store label size language. The Health Data Charter is inspired by and founded on human rights, whose universal nature, Canada has signed on all of these universal treaties and conventions, whose universal nature transcends jurisdictional and disciplinary differences. So, recognizing that international standards and data governance norms that already exist, we recognize them. The Charter is both principled, parsimonious, i.e. short, and prospective in nature. So it really wants to foster international implementation and interoperability, both within and across different national systems. So we would like this charter to serve not just Canada and bring the provinces and the feds together with this common aspirational charter to recognize constitutional and other and ethical and legal differences, but to work on a high level towards an approach that recognizes and actually makes alive, if I guess you could say, the values we have as Canadians. So first is the person-centric health information that Michael mentions that follows you no matter where you go for your clinical needs, for analytical access and use. And common standards. You can't get the records and the healthcare systems and the hospitals and the physicians to talk to each other. They need common standards for design, for stewardship, which is different from custodianship, interoperability, and for access and portability. And yes, we have to ensure that it's quality data. And that means we have to have the same standards as we just mentioned. And that way we can ensure the security and privacy while still maximizing benefit and reducing potential harm to individuals. And timely access, I think, speaks for itself across the board. And the use of health data for policies, programs, services, statistics, and research for the public good, given the importance of open science. What we just heard about wastewater is mind-blowing. And then data-driven social and technological innovation through partnership, invention, discovery, value creation, and international best practice. Because if we follow international best practice, the Europeans are creating a European, every country has a constitution, has their own rules and so on, but they're creating a European health data space to be able to share data between countries within Europe. So when their citizens travel and so on, they can follow what's happening and provide services. Plus, they can share data, particularly during pandemic. And health data literacy, and there are new techniques. There's new ways of being able to produce the data, protect the data, and share the data. And the public should be involved and learn about this. Harmonization. That's different from standardization. Harmonization of health data, governance, evaluation, and policy. This means it's interoperable, it's high level, it's not necessarily always the same, but at least it can be understood across the board. And support for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation data sovereignty. These are, that again is an internationally recognized human right. And finally, I'm waiting to see what's going to happen in the next few weeks. Inclusion of the public, patients, communities, other stakeholders in health information system development and oversight. Because I'm sure that irrespective of what is currently happening with the issue of health data in Canada, if you stop any citizen on the street, they would expect that their data is, harmonized, is of quality, can be shared and accessed for their care, can support good research that moves things forward, and serves as well, not only them, but their communities and their populations, because things can be different very much depending on environments and socioeconomic conditions in the health of Canadian citizens. So this health data charter is not a legal threat. This health data charter is a human rights charter. It's aspirational, and pardon me for saying so, but Canada should get their act together and move on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bertha. And last but not least, over to Stephen.
Great. Thanks so much, Kim. And first, just to emphasize, it's an important issue, and a big thanks to the organizers for bringing us together. I wanted to pick up on where Bertha left off because I think that I think there's a lot to be optimistic actually in this space. Of course, the challenges are deep and intense and important, but I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimism. Part of when thinking of the kind of what's needed to affect change is at the very basis a need to have a common and shared sense of the problem. We have that. There is widespread consensus that the health data systems in Canada need to be improved in order for us to ensure that we can enhance the health of Canadians. Another part of it is around to affect change is about having a clear sense that there's actually things that can be done to make that change and make things better. Again, there's just a whole lot of agreement about what needs to be done. And so in other words, some of the biggest barriers to change that might have existed, let's say 5, 10, 15 years ago, if not before, because this has been discussed and debated for decades. A lot of those things are not there. And in some respects, being able to make progress on health data could actually end up being one of the silver linings coming from the very terrible pandemic that we've all endured and are still enduring. Because I think in this pandemic, data was one of the major stories. I think Doug really beautifully highlighted at the beginning about, in some respects, data sharing. I thought there were some amazing examples of it in the pandemic, as well as, of course, examples that are not where we want to be at. And so, but data was talked about at kitchen tables across the country for good and for bad, in the sense that everyone had a view, everyone had a take, but everyone was talking data, and that's something that can be built upon. I think in addition to being one of the big stories of the pandemic, it was clear that we didn't have the data that we needed in order to mount the kind of nimble and targeted public health responses that Canadians would have liked to have seen. Part of that is based on the way our data systems were built. Part of it is around data sharing and challenges that have been described. But there's clear recognition we didn't have the data that we needed, and no jurisdiction would say otherwise. We do know, though, when thinking of the root challenges of how do we fix it, I think panelists spoke to so many of them. If I can summarize, it's very clear that this is primarily not a technology issue. Back maybe a decade ago, there were major technological barriers. Of course, there still are some that need to be worked through, but primarily this is not a technological issue anymore. This is about policy. This is about governance. It's about standards. and it's about public trust. And that in particular was emphasized in the recent reports that colleagues have mentioned of the expert advisory group for the Pan-Canadian Health Data Strategy. It was quite an honor. I had a chance. I was a member up until I think the last month of the group when I had to resign in order to move into the Public Health Agency of Canada as the Vice President for Data and Surveillance. But those reports, there's 3 of them. If you're not aware of them, if you haven't read them, definitely read them. They're great, and they've definitely been a guiding light for jurisdictions across the country in thinking through how to tackle these issues. I think in particular, the 3rd report that emphasized different options and pathways for the future is one to be read. All of that to be saying that this is, well, we're in a week when health ministers just met. And indeed, I had the chance to present on some of these issues to health ministers yesterday. And what I can definitely share, because the health ministers themselves after that meeting of themselves spoke to the media and emphasized that everyone recognizes that we have opportunities and huge value to unlock by tackling this big challenge. There's really consensus that data is very much part of the future and we need to take concerted efforts to get us there. And just the fact that this is being discussed and commented by ministers in the media, in private conversations is, I think, in and of itself, something that should give us reasons for optimism for the future. Of course, whenever we're talking about data, there's always data is political, and it should be. There's so much that's built into data. Data gives voice. What data we collect or don't collect are decisions where power is involved. There's governance and legal issues, privacy, sovereignty issues at play. And so, of course, data is political, but sometimes that's not necessarily bad in the sense that politics is the way that we collectively manage difficult issues and try to work through them. And so I personally, building Bartha on your optimism, I share that view and looking forward to the conversation with all of you during this panel about how we move forward. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And we do have questions now coming into the chat. Please feel free to put your questions there. And we have deliberately left lots of time for discussion, so we'll get to as many as we can. And I'm just going to go ahead with the first question here and invite any of the panelists who wish to respond to this to do so. So the question is a new institution needed for Canada to implement the Pan-Canadian Health Data Strategy, or is this something that the existing institutions can work on collectively? Does anybody want to get that? Michael, you'll have to unmute.
If I can start, there's clearly a reticence in Ottawa to creating more institutions. We have a number already that are at least partially or wholly in this space: InfoWay, Statistics Canada, the Canadian Institute for Health Information. But so far, none of them have had the moxie or the ability to move on the things that we're talking about. So at the very least, there needs to be some sort of change in the governance of those organizations. One of the points that was made or ideas that was put in the 3rd report of the expert advisory group was the idea of, for want of a better phrase, a Health Information Stewardship Council, emphasizing the word stewardship. As Bartha mentioned, too much of health data right now is bottled up by data custodians who are not interested. There's nothing for them in seeing the data used for public good, and there's everything for them to be risk averse. So the report that Bartha referred to 7 years ago on timely access to health data said we really need to shift from a custodianship kind of perspective to a stewardship. The challenge is, how do we get to that stewardship? And I think this requires conversation. If I can be a little more, perhaps provocative, one of the challenges is, the board of directors of CIHI includes provincial deputy ministers. The board of directors of InfoWay includes provincial deputy ministers. As I said, their interest is to avoid embarrassment. And if they see in any kind of analysis or data that might result in things that are troublesome, they'd rather not see it happen. So somehow that needs to be overcome. And my view is that one of the ways that can be overcome is by the federal government taking a stronger position. Whether it requires a new institution, not necessarily, but at the very least it requires changes in the governance of the existing players in this area.
On a hopeful note, on that issue, one positive thing I see happening in the research community is that in the last 5-6 years, the funders have been saying, when you submit your idea, we also need to know, well, how are you going to manage your data and how are you going to have others be able to access your data? In other words, how are you going to contribute your data beyond publications? Are you, and that is an issue as well. Are you going to embargo it forever for some of the reasons we saw on the different slides? And it's my data, I'm waiting. Well, how long do we have to wait for you to publish it? After which it must now become public. So you can see more of an accountability by the funding agencies on the researchers themselves to not only collect quality data, but to make it publicly available. So I think that's a positive trend. But as you see, it's a requirement. There's accountability there, because till you fill in your 2 pages on your grant, if you're lucky, you get funded. But if you do get funded, then you have to fill in those reports and how you're making your data available. So that you can see there's a carrot stick there already, Michael, which you talked about earlier.
Anybody else want to add anything on this question?
Well, again, looking at the pandemic, what were some of the successes? It was often less about institutions. It was about a PhD student, that was able to scrape the world's data and put it up available. And I think one of the concepts, kind of the Web 3.0 is, again, this interoperable data that can move and exist in multiple places and can be shared. So there's the amount of data has increased a lot, and it is increasing a lot. And the way that we're dealing with data in a modern way can be less about institutions and more about communities and people, having their data and sharing their data, and making that data available to multiple partners. Data should be going everywhere, and it is going everywhere. Yeah. So I think we can have institutions, but recognize who's generating data, using the data, the barriers for it to be moving around.
I guess if I can add another bit to what Bartha said, the Canadian Institutes for Health Research has generously funded something called the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. And it's all well and good for that CLSA data, the data they've collected directly, to be shared. But among the key bits about that survey, it's a wonderful longitudinal survey, is that it has asked people's permission, respondents' permission, to link to their healthcare records. So within each province, the data have been linked, but because of provincial barriers, the linked data cannot be shared. So it's one thing to ask people, what is your smoking history, or do you have symptoms of dementia? But if you want to understand whether they're taking any drugs or whether they've turned up at the hospital with any kind of ailments, you cannot do that statistical analysis. And let me emphasize, it's an anonymous statistical analysis. The researchers don't care who the named individuals are. They're just looking for patterns. Cannot be done because the provinces continue to block that. So CIHR, to their credit, and the granting councils are pushing for open science. This is wonderful. But in this case, or this kind of situation, often the blockage is not due to the granting councils, it's due to provincial governments and the way they're managing, bottling up, keeping in silos their healthcare data.
So I think, so again, please go ahead and put your questions in the chat. But I think this is a good point. We'd like to have one more poll question for you. So if we could put that up now, just like to get a temperature check on your response to the Health Data Charter as Bartha presented it. And while that's coming in, the answer to that poll question, I'm going to pose a question to the panelists. There's been a lot of discussion across your comments about culture and trust and the fact that things have changed. We're not where we were 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Some barriers have been broken down. Do you have, so in that trust is, I think, across institutions, across individuals, organizations, between government and the public and so on. So do you have comments on where you see the biggest issues in trust and or culture and or the best ways that we might be able to push some of those things forward?
I'm happy to start, Kim, if that's helpful, because I just wanted to say, I think I'll just more double down on the on trust being one of the most fundamentally important issues to tackle here in order to unlock the value that health data can provide. Of course, governments and other institutions can only unlock that data and make use of data as much as citizens are willing to allow those institutions to do so. I think during the pandemic, there are lots of examples where data was used and questions were asked about how it was used. Oh, I see we're getting the poll results of 100% of attendees endorsing the Health Data Charter. I will make sure to share that with my colleagues at the Public Health Agency and at Health Canada. But Kim, I think that's partly the challenge is we do not have a data culture in our society. I think the kind of misuses of data that we've seen throughout the pandemic or accidental uses of misinterpreting. It's not coming from always from a bad place, but I think it highlights we don't have great data literacy in our society. And that's not to blame anyone, not at all. It's just a reality that when we're talking about making better use of health data in order to advance the health of people in our country and maybe around the world, that if we know that we can only make use of data to the extent that citizens are comfortable with that and feel secure in that, then enhancing data literacy is going to be a key part of that. And that's not something that a government or an institution can do. That's that kind of culture change and skilling up in order to appreciate the opportunity here is something everyone's going to have to get involved with. Yeah, and there's a big road to change that's going to be needed to go down there.
Two points on that particular trust issue. About 8 years ago, Maclean's did a poll on Canadian values, and all the way from the Maritimes to BC on different issues that were, sort of hot issues. Reproductive rights, climate, the criminal code, and so on. And they found that the one value that united all Canadians was their pride in the Canadian healthcare system being universal, as they understood it to be. And so rather than defining ourselves every time, like when you're backpacking in Europe by saying you're not American, they actually made a positive, they actually made a positive statement that they were very proud that Canadians had healthcare, accessible, portable healthcare, and so on. And then again, when in a project here in Quebec, a population a project, a bit like the longitudinal study on aging that was mentioned by Michael, called Cartagene, which is a population infrastructure. It simply wants to know, it's not about you or your disease. It wants to, over time, trace the relationship between genetics and the environment, genetics and socioeconomic conditions, and genetics and employment, or genetics and the number of children you have and where you live and so on. And what they actually found was before we asked all these questions and asked people to sign up to give away their data and nothing about them, but to serve as an infrastructure for data for others. Okay, this is what's called in population genomics project. They actually got excited, and it's so positive that the collaboration rate, as you EPI people call it, I think I understand it, was actually the highest of any population project in the world. And I know because we surveyed 37 countries. And whereas in the UK Biobank, which everyone talks about, the collaboration rate was actually 6.8%. Here in Quebec, the collaboration rate of citizens who randomly, because they were selected to be representative and diverse of the modern Quebec, was 27%. And I think that says something about if you ask citizens, contribute your data so that we can understand the future, they will participate. And finally, when you explain, and I think COVID showed us, that you can't have a universal healthcare system that's sustainable. That, you know, we saw what was being asked by the provinces. We need this, look what's happening, the aging population, look what's happening with, you know, all our understaffed and so on. It can't be sustainable if there's no resource allocation. You pinpoint where you want to put your money because you understand and you know where it's needed. So when H1N came out, that's just between SARS and COVID, for those of you who forget, people in Quebec were saying, everybody get vaccinated. And there was no reason for everyone if we would have known who was at risk and who was not at risk, if we would have had that kind of population data. So it's not just about your health record being better and the services you get being better. It's actually about a universal healthcare system managing to stay alive because they have the data to be able to make the decisions they need to make.
Doug, I saw you wanted to say something. Did you want to?
Yeah, I think one thing about trust, just one comment from my experience too, like one of the high watermarks for me was being on the Ontario Science Advisory Table. And that was, there's a, you know, I think, or, you know, stepping back, like what is trust and how can we promote it? And I think we need to understand this better. And, you know, within the pandemic, again, we kind of, I think, split, like we have less trust now than we did. And at the same time, trust was one of the most important, if not the most important predictor of success around the world in terms of countries. Mm-hmm. And then for me, one of the high watermarks was being in this group, which there was a lot of trust there as well. There was a lot of openness and transparency and discussion. And so we had the Chatham House rules. So it was really true. Like we would talk and debate and vigorously, struggle with these things. And then we could immediately sort of hang up and then talk to the world about it. We had no restrictions on each other about using each other's information. We just couldn't attribute it to specific people. And you saw, you know, tweets going out, and we didn't know all the answers, but we were trying to communicate as quickly as possible. And so I think some of the words that go along with trust are safety, confidence, communication, transparency. And on the other side of that, it's fear, anxiety, guilt, shame. So, those are the kind of the word clouds that I think that we need to think about. And I'll tell you, like when it worked well, like I would have this incredible a feeling of trust with my colleagues in certain situations. In other ones, it was quite the opposite. I'd go to another meeting and we couldn't get any information out. We didn't know whether we were allowed to. We didn't trust each other. I've had in the pandemic, people say, I don't trust you, Doug. Many more than one time. And then, we hang up and say, we need to talk about that. We need to work on that. If we don't address that, we won't be able to achieve what we want to achieve. So those are just sort of personal comments from my experience kind of through the pandemic.
Michael, you wanted to add something?
I do, but maybe there's another question here about human resource constraints. Should we turn to that first?
Well, I will, yes, we can add this in. I don't want to distract you from what you wanted to say, but the question that came through is are human resource constraints a barrier to enhancing health data literacy and to building a national health data system? And if so, how do we overcome that? So I think add on to that or fold that in, Michael, and then we'll see if others want to respond as well. Okay,
well, let me first comment on the data literacy and human resource constraints and make two observations. Actually, when I was a baby public servant and before that a student, I have a couple degrees in economics. And I would observe that data is second nature in ministries of finance and in the Bank of Canada. And that's because the training of the people who occupy senior positions, not just junior positions, they're comfortable with data and statistics. The recruitment in the Public Health Agency, no comment on you, Stephen, here, and the Ministry of Health, has tended to be more legal health professional. And my experience over many years is that data is something rather alien. I once gave a lunch talk at the Public Health Agency, which I entitled, "Data Can Be Your Friend." So there's one issue there in terms of the very big difference in data comfort levels in the various organizational structures in health compared, for example, to economic ministries. Another one is physicians, and I don't want to dump Doug, you're an exception in terms of being extremely comfortable and leading in data analysis. But one of the things at one point we batted around as an idea is how to adjust the curriculum for medical schools. Because, there's no end of things that doctors ought to learn about. Some people say they should learn a lot more about nutrition, but certainly being comfortable and self-sufficient in data, understanding data and analysis and epidemiology and stats. So that's another crucial part. I think there are some other kinds of surveys at a different level. Data literacy is, and just functional literacy is a broader problem in the population. But I think Kim, I don't want to put Kim on the spot, but you would know of some studies where the public in general are very supportive of the idea of using their data for public good purposes, not just for their own care, although that's obviously important. So a couple of areas there have to do with the recruitment in the key organizations in the health sector and with the training, particularly of the leaders of healthcare, which are physicians, nurses too. Others should be more data literate than they are, but doctors by and large call the shots in the way healthcare system functions. I'll leave my other comments, for when we do the wrap up maybe. On trust, unless you'd like me to carry on with that.
Well, let's see if others want to pick up on this, on the things you've put on the table already. Are there other comments from others?
Well, I'm happy to chime in briefly, Kim, just to say I don't think so. Human resource constraints are maybe a challenge, but not an absolute barrier, in the sense that, of course, in order to build world-class health data systems, you need to be able to recruit great world-class data scientists and partner and be good partners with world-class data scientists, which do exist in Canada across many different sectors, especially universities, but also private sector and teaching hospitals elsewhere. But it's a challenge, but I don't think it's an absolute barrier, in the sense that there's many people out there who go through many great university programs or other places, get the skills they need in order to contribute to building these systems. And for every, there's always challenges in recruiting these people, because of course there's certain skill sets that are very highly sought after, and to stay in the public sector, whether that's sort of in research, whether that's in government, whether that's in healthcare, salaries are not always the same as they are at some technology firms that will pay very different salaries. But a lot of people are motivated by public good, right? And I mean, one of the amazing things of working at the Public Health Agency of Canada is that the mission is just so clear. It's improving the health of Canadians, and that gets me really excited every morning. I mean, I personally enjoy that Netflix has a great algorithm for suggesting the next thing I should watch, and I do benefit and get happiness out of that. But I don't think I would personally be as excited about jumping to work every day and helping make that algorithm even better. It's actually pretty good, at least it works for me. But my point is, so in that respect, it is a challenge. It's certainly a challenge. I spend actually quite a lot of my time since I moved into the agency thinking about how do we recruit and retain excellent people in addition to the excellent people that we have. But I wouldn't say it's the biggest barrier. Yeah.
Thanks. Anybody else want to add to this? So I want to kind of unite a number of things that are being said, and then maybe we'll wrap this up. And don't see more questions coming in, so maybe I'll pose this and then ask each of you to make a few final comments that you would like to just sort of, you know, the path forward or whatever kind of things you want to say in closing. I think what I'm seeing is that a lot of these things are very much related one to another. So this the notion that Bartha talked about, that Canadians have pride in our universal health care, but as we learn more about it, now we're seeing that there are cracks in the system and it's not working as well as it should for everybody. And a lot of the conversations around equity and all those important things that have really been advanced by the pandemic over the last few years really make that clear. And that then relates to health data literacy in part because we don't have all of the data we need, but also in part because we can't necessarily, not everybody understands how to interpret or then to act on that data. But then all of that leads into this trust and the lack of trust that people might have because it's very hard to trust what you don't understand or which you don't understand that other people are doing on your behalf. So these things seem very much kind of a ball of wax. And so I leave to you to make any final comments that you wish. I'm not trying to completely direct those, but I think this kind of like, how do we tackle this complex set of problems when there are so many different things that kind of contribute to the situation that we're in now? I think this relates back to that first question about institutions as well, and what we talked about in the third report from the expert advisory group on the Pan-Canadian Health Data Strategy about the importance of collective action and really kind of bringing many, many different organizations and groups together. So how do we push this forward? What would be your sort of main next steps, and what do you want to leave with the group for thinking further about after today? And I will look for a volunteer to go first on this.
I don't mind going first.
Go ahead, brother.
Two points in closing. One, what we're finding out in a lot of the projects I work on, which is in genomics and genomic research, human genomics, is that the quality of the data is not up to par. And we're producing devices and drugs and algorithms and clinical support tools for physicians that are based on data sets that are not representative of the Canadian modern heterogeneous population and all its diversity. So we need lots more data from lots more Canadians from wherever they came, where their grandparents came, or if they were born here or whatever. And I mean across the country, because if we don't have those large quality data sets with minimal data, but that indicates origins, ancestry, and so on, we are producing tools, devices, drugs, and so on that either are harmful because they're based on a population that's not real, it's not representative, it's not diverse, or it's going to be simply insufficient and a waste of money. So there's something to be said about universality, including a concentration or more emphasis, I should say, on how the individual can recognize that as a citizen in a country with a universal healthcare system, we need more data that represents everyone that is part of modern Canada. And and I guess that ties into those three human rights on which the Health Charter is based: the right to the highest attainable state of health. It doesn't say you have a right to be born healthy, but the highest attainable state of health, the right of everyone, that's the word in the treaty, everyone, Canada signed and ratified, to benefit from science and its advances, and the right to non-discrimination. And non-discrimination kind of fits in with this first point I made, that it has to be representative and not discriminatory in the fact that in the very way the data is collected. And my last point is in January 2023 in Europe, the Data Governance Act will come into effect, and including health data, economic, all kinds of data. And they have one motto, which is in the recital. Recital is like a preamble, but you've got to watch it because they say everything sometimes in the recital. And this is recital number 13. And it's about data in Europe in the future, January 2023. As open as possible, comma, as closed as necessary. And I think if we can do that, we can move the whole health data sharing forward in Canada in a protected, secure way, but one that I think really will make our health system of greater quality.
Thank you, Bertha. Do you want to go next?
Oh.
Go ahead, Michael.
First, one of the things that I think is really positive, and this is also building off the question earlier we were discussing about trust, is that privacy commissioners have, particularly I'm thinking of the federal privacy commissioner in some remarks he made, it's the previous one, maybe a year or so ago, who said that we are not standing in the way and we're not blocking the appropriate use of health information. This was in the context of COVID and all that. As long as the data respect the legislation and privacy principles, we're fine. But we need to understand that it is not the job of privacy commissioners to champion the use of data. Their job is to make sure that when data are used, they're used appropriately, especially with respect to privacy. We lack champions for the use of these data. And in addition to the governance question, that seems to me, for example, an obvious kind of champion would be the CEO of the Canadian Institute for Health Research. Ideally, the provincial ministers and deputy ministers of health should be champions. Let me come back. I mentioned very briefly an example about heart attacks and 3 times as many bypass surgeries in one part of the country than another. But this is an example of a more general kind of statistical analysis that uses person-level data, and it's called small area variations. Why is it that in some people call it postal code medicine? Why is it in some parts of the country your chance of getting a radical mastectomy are 2 or 3 times as high as another part? There are endless numbers of these, and what they signal is that there is, certainly in the US, where these analyses have been done much more than in Canada. Why haven't they been done more in Canada? Come back to that in a second. They show that there is wasted resources, that people are not running the healthcare system as efficiently or managing it as well as one could. So every time I hear the provincial premiers bleat about give us more money, I say, wait a minute, have you got your own house in order? You claim you have the jurisdiction, you've been running the health sector for a long time, you've screwed up human resources, you haven't figured out how to run things efficiently. Give me a break, talking from a pan-Canadian or a federal point of view. So what's wrong here? It's been obvious to anybody who's looked at the literature or studied that there are potentially significant savings in dollars in the way the healthcare system is run. So the next question, or the answer, and there's a wonderful health economist here in Canada, Bob Evans out at UBC, who reminds us that every dollar of healthcare cost is somebody's income. And we seem to be afraid in these kinds of discussions to talk about vested interests. Trust is wonderful. I think it's fundamentally important. The privacy commissioners have said we're not barriers here. But at the same time, who are the vested interests who are making the most money off this? Well, I'm afraid to say often it's physicians who don't like having nurse practitioners and so on and so on. Anyway, that's a big digression. But I think the biggest barrier to moving ahead here is federal-provincial relationships. The federal government is being beat up and being asked for lots of money. It's not clear that the provinces are spending the money they already have wisely, but they don't want to create or participate in creating the kinds of data that would allow us to see. Maybe the amount they're spending is quite right and they really do need more, but we don't have a clue because we don't have the data to tell us. 2 more quick comments, if I may. The phrase accountability comes up, and it's bad federal-provincial relations, it seems to me, for the federal government to say part of the reason we want the data is to hold the provinces accountable. the federal government should be accountable for billions of dollars it does spend to federal taxpayers, who happen to be the same as provincial taxpayers. It's where there's one taxpayer, they just send checks to two different levels of government. But the more important thing, and this is the way it was put back in the time of the 2004 First Ministers Accord, is to say, we don't want you, the provinces, to be accountable to us, the federal government. We want you to be accountable to your public, to the members of the residents of your province. And finally, it seemed, again, trust is wonderful. Right kind of way of articulating accountability is fundamentally important. But in the end, I think I hate to make the analogy to the emergency measures thing, but when push comes to shove, the federal government has to stand up and say, we're going to put strings on the money, because that's been the missing piece for 30 years now in terms of federal provincial fiscal transfers. So maybe I'm a bit of a rant, but there you go.
Thank you, Michael. Doug or Stephen?
Well, I think a little bit with some trepidation, I want to bring up OCAP, the ownership, control, access, possession. I was talking with some folks who from Nunavut who like to link their information to the census and use that to try to tackle TB, and they just couldn't understand. Well, that's our data. We gave the responses to the census, so why can't we access it? And why do we have to go through all these hoops and hurdles? And it's true. I think we think like if I had a few decrees, it would be like, let's not call it my data or StatsCan data or data. I like to call it data collected by StatsCan or data housed at ICES. And I think bringing it back to that what we started with and that charter, that it is our community's data and our data. And who is it, the province, saying that I fill out the survey, I say I want my data linked, and it can't be shared? Why can you say that? It's not your data, it's my data. And so I think some of that concepts, and for me, it really brought back when I've been working, around looking at OCAP, and I've talked with my First Nations colleagues. I say, I hate to kind of bring this up, but I don't want to make it sound like all communities matter, because that sounds like all lives matter, and diminishes, that why that develops, the racialization. But some of those concepts, I think, really resonate with a lot of communities beyond First Nations, and that we want our data. Communities want their data to be used to help them, and people are getting in the way of that.
Kim, I'm happy just to briefly say I'm just really excited that we can have these kind of conversations at a conference like this. That this is one of the most important issues facing health in Canada right now. These kind of conversations are also happening, I know, in many other countries around the world. Probably no country has figured out exactly how to do this right, but of course there are many other places from which we can learn on how to do better. And so I think just having the fact that when health ministers across the country met yesterday and we're talking about health data, that's pretty impressive already, in a sense, at least highlighting that if there is going to be change, it should be now. And I guess we'll hopefully have a lot of allies and partners in trying to make something really important happen at this moment, where people recognize the problem. There are solutions. It's just about figuring out how to implement. So thanks so much for this opportunity, Kim, and everyone.
Thank you so much to our panel, to participants for great questions. I want to just leave with a couple things. I just repeat the small pithy saying that Bartha talked about, which is this idea of health data being as open as possible, as closed as necessary, which would be kind of turning on its head, I think, the way that we traditionally have thought about data, which is, as protected as possible and only as much sharing as is minimally acceptable. So that turning that on its head would be a good thing. And then I really appreciate people's response to the health data charter, which, as you can see, was intended to be person-centered, community-focused, interoperable, and based on trust and data literacy, which I think are ingredients that we've talked about through this whole session as being really fundamentally important. And the last thing I would just say, well, maybe two things. One is that trust is multidimensional. This is not about governments needing people in Canada to trust them, governance of all levels. It's also about people needing governments to push trust in that other direction as well. And I think that relates to Doug's last comment about data sharing, and that sort of mutuality and seen in the health data collection, use, sharing, and literacy, of course. And then the final thing I'll leave you with is that I hope that you will see more about the Health Data Charter. There's a number of groups that are trying to push that forward and really try to get some endorsement, and for that to be sort of a cement and the kind of vehicle that we could use to assess how we're doing on all of the other things that we've been talking about today. So I hope that you as individuals, organizations, and so on would endorse that if there's an opportunity to do so, if that becomes more public. So thank you so much for your participation. I think CSPC is going to be sending out some kind of poll or surveys. Please watch for that, and enjoy the rest of the sessions. Thank you for coming today.